Welcome to our second talk on interior peace by using the book by Father Philippe. You know, Father Philippe, when he's talking about interior peace, obviously one of the big questions are going to be, what are the things that stop us from getting that interior peace? What are the excuses that we use or that the devil uses to throw at us in order to prevent us from living with the interior peace that God wants us to live with? The interior peace that's going to let God do whatever he wants in our hearts. And you know, Father Philippe, very practical man, he's really good at dividing things down. He says there are basically going to be two main reasons why we lack interior peace. The first one is pretty simple. We don't trust. And we don't trust because we fear that somehow by giving things to God, by putting things in God's hands, we're going to be missing something that we need. We're going to be lacking, or we're going to be without something that's going to be essential for me to have my happiness. And, you know, we have to be honest with ourselves. In reality, what is there in our lives that we can absolutely guarantee for ourselves? You and I can't even guarantee we're going to be alive tomorrow. We could think that we're triathletes or professional athletes or whatever. We could get in a car accident and be dead 10 minutes from now. I know perfectly healthy people, seemingly were in great shape, good athletes, whatever, and they suddenly have a heart attack. Without realizing it, there was something there. There was something, a little time bomb waiting inside, just waiting for that moment to go. You and I could be perfectly well employed, and all of a sudden, next day, we don't have a job. There are all kinds of things that can happen in life where we think that we have security by ourselves, but in reality, there is nothing. There is nothing that we can do that will give absolute security. And as we said earlier, especially in the spiritual life, in the spiritual life, more than any other field, is where Jesus is saying, without me, you can do nothing, holds true. And this isn't to make us depressed. This is simply to make us understand, okay, if I can't do it by myself, then where am I going to put my comfort? Where am I going to put my security? There's only one place. It can really only be in God. And when I have that confidence that in God, I have a security that will never really fail, then I will have the peace that we're looking for. So what are the things that we try to find our own security in? It could be friendships. It could be, like I said earlier, our health. It could be our wealth. It could be our positions. It could be our own image of ourselves. It could be all kinds of things that we tend to try to deal with by ourselves. And really, this goes back to our original temptation in the Garden of Eden. What did Adam and Eve do? Basically, God allowed them to be challenged, and he basically asked them, will you trust in me? Are you going to do things by my rules? And they said, no. In the end, we're going to have to try to do things by ourselves. And, you see what that got them. Now, Father Philippe actually goes so far as to say, the greatest way for us to lose our interior peace is for us to try to seek it by ourselves. Now, how many of us, in reality, try to seek interior peace by controlling things on a daily basis? Probably all of us. Probably all of us, one way or another, are trying to find interior peace by our own merits. And he says, the greatest way that we can possibly lose our interior peace is by trying to do it on our own. Well, why? Because inevitably it's going to fail. And even if it's succeeding right now, we're always worried about the fact that sooner or later it could fail. So again, the solution is going to be pretty much putting our security into God's hands. You know, he reflects on what is the passage of Jesus in St. Matthew. He says, look at the lilies in the field, for example. They don't spin, they don't do anything, but I assure you that the grass of the field has been clothed more splendidly than even King Solomon in all of his glory. He talks about the birds that don't do anything. They don't build barns or anything, but God takes care of them. It doesn't even occur to the birds or the animals or anything to be worried. They just do their business and God watches over them. Now, does this mean that you and I need to be irresponsible? No. I mean, obviously God gave us a mind, he gave us bodies, he gave us gifts to be able to do things in life, and we should do things in life. We should be responsible. The difference is, am I going to get worried about whether or not things succeed? Am I going to put my security in whether or not my plans are working or not? So the first obstacle of fearing that somehow I'm going to lose something by putting things into God's hands, it comes down to basically a lack of belief in God's providence. And I think a lot of the reason why we don't believe in God's providence is simply because how many of us have really experienced it? If we're honest with ourselves, how many of us have really thrown ourselves just right out there and said, I'm just going to let God do his thing here? Until we've experienced that God loves us, until we've experienced that when we let God take care of things for us, that he's going to watch over it, of course we're never really going to be able to trust. It's like a little baby. How does a baby learn that mom and dad love the baby and that mom and dad will be there? It's not going to be because mom and dad, some complicated theory or something. It's not going to be because the baby figures it out. It's simply going to be because the baby grows up experiencing, every time I cry, mom and dad are there for me. Father Philippe actually gives a very good example of that. He talks about a parachute. He says, if a person is on an airplane, you're never going to experience the fact that a parachute works, that you can count on a parachute unless you actually make the jump, right? I mean, there's no point in just trusting in the parachute if you're not going to use the thing in the end. St. John of the Cross goes on to say, he said, look, God gives to us in the measure that we actually expect for him to give to us. What's he saying there? He says if we don't expect anything from him, if we ask him but we don't really believe or we don't really put things into his hands, we don't make that leap of faith, well, God's going to give to us in that measure. But if we really make a leap of faith, then God's going to do great things for us. And that's why, what do we see in the lives of the saints, especially founders of religious orders? Let's take, for example, Mother Teresa. She's going to be canonized very soon. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, how did she start? Okay, Christ appeared to her in different visions and what have you, convinced her to leave the convent of Loreto and said, go out into the street alone. And she went out into the street basically alone. I think she had gathered maybe a couple of her ex-students to help her out as her first sisters. But she went out alone. She took care of the poor and the sick and the dying. And her mentality was, well, look, I don't even know what I'm going to eat tomorrow. I don't know what we're going to do tomorrow. I don't know where anything is going to come from. But today I'm going to do everything I can. I'm in your hands, God. And God took care of her. Every single day, one way or another, help came. One way or another, God stepped in. He allowed things to happen. He moved people's hearts. He brought things to her. And now we see this woman about to be canonized. We see thousands of nuns, thousands of brothers, even priests, missionaries around the world touching people's lives because in the beginning, one person, one woman made a leap of faith. And why don't we make those leaps of faith? In the end of the day, I think if we're honest, it's because we're scared. We're scared because we know we're going to suffer, or we think we're going to suffer. And suffering is always going to be a question mark. Why does God let it happen? Why should there even be suffering? It's one of those philosophical questions that, really there's no philosophical answer for it. And the reason God allows suffering is very simply because he wants to allow it so that he can bring forth a greater good. In the first video we mentioned the crucifixion, the greatest possible suffering, the greatest act of evil imaginable, the worst crime in human history, and from that, God brought forth the greatest possible good. So if God is going to allow suffering in our lives, and he will, there's no doubt, he allows you to suffer, he allows me to suffer, he allows everybody to suffer, and actually, he tends to allow the people that are closest to him to suffer more. If God is going to allow that, it's not because he's mean, it's not because he's forgotten about us, it's because he wants to allow greater goods to come out of that. And in that regard, that's why saints consider suffering actually to be a gift, because they recognize this is God, in a certain sense, investing. It's like every time you invest in a stock, you have to sacrifice. You have to take money that you could spend somewhere else, you could do something with it, and invest it over here. Well, it's the same thing here. We have to invest our spiritual wealth, our spiritual money, and put it into something that isn't so pleasant. But from that, God is going to bring forth, if we let him, a huge return. And the question is always going to be, do I trust? Do I trust and I'm going to be generous to let God do this? Do I trust that when God allows hard things to happen in my life, that I'm going to let him bring forth greater good? Because if you and I keep running away from those hardships, well, other hardships are going to come, number one. But number two, we're never going to get the good things that he wants to bring out of them. We're always just going to be stuck with the original hardship. You know, if you and I understood everything in the spiritual life, if we understood always why God lets us suffer or why those things happen, one question we could honestly ask ourselves is this: if I understood everything, where would there be space for faith? Where would there be space in my life for trust? Where would there be space for me to be able to say, Lord, I don't get everything, but I trust in you. I trust in you as a person. Even when, just like the Blessed Virgin Mary during that Holy Saturday, even when she didn't understand everything, she didn't understand the why of so many things, but she trusted. She said, Lord, I trust that this is something you allowed. And even if I don't know what you're going to do, I trust in you. Now, how do we become men and women like the Blessed Virgin Mary? How did she bring forth that kind of a response when she didn't have all the answers? There is no substitute for being men and women who pray. And Father Jacques Philippe, he doesn't actually just use the word to pray. He's not even just, having devotions and things. He says, we need to contemplate the face of Christ. He says there's no simple solution. There's no other way around it. If we contemplate Christ regularly, daily, we have time for what he refers to as mental prayer, other times referred to as meditation. If we have that daily contact, silent mental prayer with Christ, that is where we experience him. That's where he becomes a living person to us. That's where very slowly, bit by bit every day, we grow in those virtues and those graces that we need to be able to deal with, to be able to understand he's always with me. One of the principles that Father Philippe is very adamant about is this. He says, either we believe and trust all the way, or we don't believe at all. It's pretty much an all or nothing deal. And again, let's go back to Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Let's use that example we gave earlier in the talk. Let's pretend Mother Teresa said, okay, Lord, I'm going to trust in you a little bit. I'm going to go out, I'm going to work hard as long as it's daytime and everything. But then at nighttime, I'm going to go back to my other convent and try to bring my sisters with me, because in the end of the day, we need a little bit of security. Would God have been able to do anything really with her? No. She would not have had that experience. She wouldn't have been an instrument that lets God do everything, no matter how he wants, no matter what he wants. He wouldn't have been able to do all the things that he eventually did with her and through her. It's only when we pretty much take that blind leap of faith. You can't open up a parachute halfway. You either jump and you open it and it opens all the way, or you don't open it. There's no halfway. There's no little bit of parachute. The spiritual life is going to be the same thing. So, during these weeks when we're talking about interior peace, if we want God to fill our hearts with his peace, then let's make that resolution right now. Lord, I'm going to take the jump. I'm going to take the jump so you can open the parachute. I'm going to have the experience of what it means for you to be the one who is all of my security. Until next week, thank you so much. God bless.